I'm so grateful to the RSA for giving me this opportunity, kind of 4 or 5 months into my job, just to range across the issues that the Home Office shares with other departments, but which the Home Office is primarily responsible for, and just express some thoughts of how the climate is changing in respect of the traditional job, perhaps, of a Home Secretary. It was in 1782 when Prime Minister Lord Rockingham divided the principal duties of the state into 2 parts, and the very first cabinet posts were created of Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary. For most of the 2 centuries that followed, international and domestic threats to security were distinct and could more or less be dealt with separately. The business of war making, peacemaking and trade with fellow nation states came under the Foreign Office. The task of keeping Britain's streets safe fell to the Home Office. Today there is no longer an easy and convenient distinction between what is international and what is domestic. Crime and antisocial behaviour are experienced as local issues, though their causes often reach beyond national borders. A crack den in Manchester provides drugs that originated in the cocoa plantations of South America, or the poppy fields of Afghanistan, where they are harvested and sold to narco barons who help to fund the Taliban. By the time these drugs are smuggled into the UK, they will have travelled through multiple national borders and a host of criminal networks. So tackling crime and antisocial behaviour in all its manifestations has a significant international dimension. Our agents in the Serious Organised Crime Agency are involved in counter-narcotics operations around the world. To give just one example, it was soccer agents working with the Royal Navy and operatives from the US, Spain and France who intercepted $55 million worth of cocaine off the coast of Venezuela 3 months ago. So if the global aspects of crime and disorder are perhaps unclear, immigration is easily located in the public consciousness as an international issue and one that has been greatly magnified by globalisation. Now, it's recently become fashionable to accuse politicians in mainstream parties of shying away from the debate on immigration, which is why I want to talk about it today, tomorrow, next week, and on any occasion I can. The criticism may well have been valid, but we'll see what media coverage a rational discussion actually receives. But in addressing the ramifications of migration, governments across the world have to resolve the conflict between national interest, i.e. what's best for our economy, and the legitimate concerns of the electorate. Too often, what gets lost in any discussion on immigration are the reasonable expectations of the moderate majority. These are the people who accept that immigration has enriched our society from its culture to its cuisine. They accept the economic case for immigration but want it to be carefully controlled and monitored. They accept that offering asylum to those who face persecution in their own land is part of our island story, part of what makes us a civilised and mature democracy. But they want to be confident that those who have no right to be here, whether foreign national prisoners, illegal immigrants or failed asylum seekers, are identified and speedily removed. So I welcome any opportunity to talk about immigration policy, but there are, I believe, 4 clear principles which all rational participants in this debate must observe. First, that there is no sensible argument for immigration to cease altogether, and no sensible mainstream politicians are actually arguing that it should. Second, that there are communities which have been disproportionately affected by immigration, where people have legitimate concerns about the strain that the growth in the local population has placed on jobs and services. Third, that the problems caused by immigration in recent years are not unique to this country. They're shared by governments across the West. And fourth, that it's reasonable to expect those who come to live amongst us to learn the language, obey the laws, and pay their taxes. Whilst I accept that governments of both persuasions, including this one, have been maladroit in their handling of this issue at times, I do believe that the UK is now far more successful at tackling migration than most of its European and North American neighbours. We were one of the first countries in the world to introduce biometric visas. We were one of the first to introduce ID cards for foreign nationals. We are one of the only countries in the world that resolves asylum cases with an objective of full completion within 6 months. That means not just that a decision is made in 6 months, it includes the time it takes to return failed asylum seekers to their country of origin. And the independent and expert advice of the Migration Advisory Committee is admired by countries across the world, many of whom are creating similar versions. This government has never pursued an open-door policy on immigration. The former civil servant who claimed recently that in 2001 we had, now says that his words were twisted out of all context. I read the article, I know the history, I'm responsible for the policy. The article was complete and utter nonsense. Since the Immigration and Asylum Act of 1999, the rules about who comes here and who can't have been steadily tightened. And we are the only government in British history to have introduced a system where it's possible not just to physically count people in and out of the country, but to know which individuals have left and which have arrived. As I've said, our record isn't perfect. When we came into government in 1997, there was no magic button we could push immediately to resolve all the historical, political and operational problems associated with immigration. The legacy problems with unreturned foreign national prisoners and asylum seekers may have accumulated under previous administrations, but they continued for far too long on our watch. Like many other countries, we struggled to contain the huge surge in migration, legal and illegal, that emerged from countries such as Kosovo, Iraq, Zimbabwe, Sri Lanka, and Somalia. But this shouldn't overshadow the real and rapid progress we've made, particularly in the last 3 years. In 2001, an illegal immigrant could arrive at Sangatte, from where, with comparative ease, they could conceal themselves in a freight vehicle or train and cross the channel. The reason why this problem has been reduced so dramatically is that the border no longer starts at the White Cliffs of Dover, it stretches to northern France. A freight vehicle is likely to be scanned before leaving French soil. Last year, 28,000 people were stopped from crossing the channel illegally. The number of illegal immigrants detected in Kent has fallen by 90% since 2001. Those who do enter the country and claim asylum will, in all likelihood, have their case processed, as I've said, in 6 months, including the time taken to deport them, if their claim failed. In 1997, it took an average of 22 months. By 2001, it had come down but only to 18 months. For the first time in this country's history, we have a reliable way of checking individuals in and out of the country. It's called e-borders, and when complete next year, it will deal effectively with the perennial problem of the visa overstayer, which has always been the principal route to illegal settlement. Already it means that our border effectively stretches even further beyond our coastline. Today, if someone applies for a visa in New York, their information will be checked instantly against thousands of records of people who tried to enter the country illegally, who are known criminals or are suspected of being involved in terrorist activities. If there's a match, it's in New York that they will be prevented from entering the UK, not at Heathrow or Gatwick. E-borders will be fully operational by 2014, and together with record numbers of foreign prisoners being returned and the completion of the legacy cases on immigration and asylum by summer 2011, it will ensure that the problems of the past are resolved while similar problems in the future are avoided. The Conservative Party says that there should be a cap on immigration. Let me be clear about this. A cap is not a moratorium. What they propose is an arbitrary, predetermined fixed figure on the number of non-EEA nationals allowed to work or study in the UK. They have yet to tell us what the figure would be or how it would be determined. The cap may be so high that it's immaterial or so low that they'd need to explain which young people would not be allowed to come here to study. Are they intending to stop those who have the legal right to join family members? We don't know that, and we don't know what they will say to employers who cannot recruit skilled staff because they've reached this arbitrary predetermined limit. And we don't know how they will deal with the changing social and economic conditions that will emerge after their cap has been fixed. As the Financial Times commented last month, and I quote, "At best, the Conservative policy could make little difference, and at worst, they could damage business. A Tory government would better spend its time fine-tuning the points-based system, which, though suffering some teething problems, appears a sensible approach," unquote. The removal of 80 different routes into Britain under the old work permit system and its replacement by the points-based system in 2007 has radically overhauled how we control economic migration so we can balance the needs of the economy with the indigenous demand for jobs. Most significantly, it is a flexible system that can be adjusted to meet changing circumstances. The Conservatives are perfectly entitled to argue for a cap. I believe it's illogical and opaque, but it recognises the need for immigration and proposes to deal with it in a different way. What they are not entitled to do is claim that Britain has an open-door policy. This willful misrepresentation of the facts is a hangover from their dog-whistle politics of the last election. What's needed in Britain is a rational debate based on the facts, and protecting our borders requires us to be active in resolving the international issues that increase our vulnerability. On counter-terrorism, many of the major terrorist plots of recent years have links to Pakistan or the porous borders in the mountains between Afghanistan and Pakistan. As last Thursday's discovery in South Waziristan of a German passport belonging to Saeed Bahaji, a close associate of one of the 9/11 hijackers, reminds us, nothing better illustrates how our involvement in Afghanistan and the support we offer the Pakistan government are essential to the safety and security of our citizens here. The democratically elected government of Pakistan is currently embroiled in a serious conflict with Taliban insurgents who have launched countless attacks on innocent Pakistani citizens and who continue to shelter al-Qaeda in the mountains between Pakistan and Afghanistan. There is little doubt from leading experts that without the support of the British government and coalition forces from 42 other countries, Afghanistan would once more become a safe haven for terrorists, and this would magnify the risk of future terrorist attacks and completely destabilise an already unstable region. The biggest threat to these extremists is the resilience and confidence of the communities they claim to represent. The overwhelming majority of Muslims are horrified by those who distort Islam to justify atrocities here and abroad. The UK stands alongside the Islamic Republic of Pakistan in the fight against religious extremists, not because of their religion, but because of their extremism. Our Prevent strategy is based on a very simple premise that British Muslims must be at the forefront of undermining those who seek to distort Islam in order to justify terrorism, and they should be supported in those efforts. It goes hand in hand with tackling social exclusion and deprivation, which disproportionately affect the Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities in this country, and challenging those far-right extremists who peddle anti-Muslim propaganda, who say that Islam is based on violence and oppression, or that it has no place in democratic Western society. Prevent is categorically not about spying, and false assertions to the contrary can damage the good partnership work going on in communities across the country. Islam clearly advocates the right to life, to freedom of expression, to belief, justice, and equality of opportunity. These are universal values. They are remarkable in their similarity to the articles of the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was agreed by 58 member states, including many Muslim states, in 1948. While the nature and scale of the threats to security have changed irrevocably, as well as the tools we need to tackle them, these values have not dimmed in their significance over the 61 years since the Declaration was launched, or since the UK played such a major role in drafting the European Convention on Human Rights, which is now incorporated into our domestic legislation through the Human Rights Act of 1998. In our determination to protect this country from terrorist attack, there are occasions when the rights of the individual have to be weighed against the rights of society as a whole, a modern version of a dilemma that has always been a fact of Home Office life. It is human rights legislation that ensures that this balance is struck correctly, not because it pitches the rights of the individual against the will of the state, but because it helps to ensure that the response of the state is proportionate to the threat. By necessity, there will be times when such rights are inconvenient to the government of the day, but that's not an argument to repeal the Human Rights Act. On the contrary, it demonstrates its necessity. Sir Edward Coke, the Attorney General who prosecuted Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators, said this: "Howsoever these traitors have exceeded all others their predecessors in mischief, yet neither will the king exceed the usual punishment of law, nor invent any new torture or torment for them, but is graciously pleased to afford them, as well as ordinary course of trial, as an ordinary punishment much inferior to their offence." Close quotation marks. Fair enough, he said that before they were hung, drawn and quartered, but nevertheless, even in the 17th century, when many people still believed in the divine right of kings, in dealing with one of the first acts of terrorism on British soil, it was the law that was the ultimate authority, not the state. I just want to touch on two aspects of policy where the issue of what is proportionate has been hotly debated. The first is on the regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, on which we will publish a review very shortly. In the late 1990s, we witnessed a huge growth in communications technology. The use of mobile phones and email became ubiquitous. At the same time, the regulation of who could use communications data and for what purpose was patchy and unclear. Other techniques, such as covert surveillance, were not regulated at all. The aim of RIPA, as it's become known, was not to grant new powers to the state, but to protect the public from the excessive use of existing powers. The public willingly accepts that in their efforts to bring criminals to justice, the police should be able to locate people by their mobile phone records. They will also no doubt accept that there's a case for the Environment Agency being able to use such techniques to track down companies who are disposing of toxic waste illegally, or for the Civil Nuclear Constabulary to use covert surveillance to protect nuclear power stations. But they will not accept such powers being used to spy on people who put their rubbish out on the wrong day or let their dogs foul the streets, because this is clearly not proportionate. There is no evidence that such practice is widespread, but I want to make it clear that in no circumstances is it acceptable. If agencies use RIPA powers for such trivial reasons, the case for using them to track down serious offenders who put public safety at risk rapidly diminishes in the eyes of the public. The second proportionality issue is control orders. If someone is suspected of being involved in terrorist activity, then our first objective will always be for that person to be tried and prosecuted in an open court or deported if they are foreign nationals. But there are a handful of people who undoubtedly pose a substantial threat to public safety and who, for good reason, cannot be deported or prosecuted, either because in the case of foreign nationals their safety cannot be guaranteed if they're returned to their home country, or because we do not always have sufficient admissible evidence. These cases are very rare. When I made my last report to Parliament, there were only 15 control orders in force, and the total number of people who have ever been subject to a control order is 44. In comparison, between 2001 and 2008, there were nearly 1,500 terrorist-related arrests, 35% of which led to a charge, compared with 31% of arrests for other offences. Control orders are subject to rigorous scrutiny. The High Court gives permission for orders to be made and subsequently undertakes a full review of each case. That review considers whether there is sufficient reason to believe that the individual in question is involved in terrorist activity and whether a control order is necessary to protect the public. This is an area of law where there is little precedent, and case law is consequently developing all the time. There have inevitably been legal challenges, in particular in relation to Articles 5 and 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And in some instances, for this very small number of cases, there is no doubt that complying with the judgments that have come from these challenges has made the work of the police and the security service more difficult. Not impossible, but more difficult. But these compromises and adjustments are an essential part of the process through which we strive to get the balance right, protecting the public, but in a way that's proportionate to the threat and without disregarding the values enshrined in our laws. Over the last 227 years that have passed since Lord Shelburne was appointed as the first ever Home Secretary alongside Charles Fox as the first Foreign Secretary, Shelburne and Fox would recognise much of what Johnson and Miliband have to... Miliband's out of government at the moment. There hasn't been a cabinet reshuffle in my journey across here. Would recognise much of what Johnson and Miliband have to contend with, but the global context in which matters of safety and security have to be considered would have seemed alien. Some seek to simplify the role of the Home Secretary into a series of choices between global and local, between opening the door to immigrants or closing it completely, between liberty and security. But the world in which we live does not support such simplicity. It's doubtful whether it ever did, because there is no liberty without security. It would be foolhardy to stop immigration altogether, and equally so to actively encourage it through an open door policy. There is no grand contest between the rights of the individual and the will of the state, because the state must uphold both individual rights and those of society as a whole. Home Secretaries are often portrayed as having to make another choice between a kind of louche liberalism and ironclad authoritarianism. A decade into the 21st century, such choices are irrelevant. The prime duty of the state, ensuring the safety of its citizens, is more complex and varied than it has ever been. But the universal values that were forged by the internationalism of the last century are as relevant today as they have ever been. Only by protecting them can we secure our democracy for the future. Thank you.
Politicians exist at the sharp end of this, where the rubber hits the road, as they say. They have the day-to-day issues to deal with. And the Home Secretary talked a lot about globalization, and that was the theme that I wanted to pick up. The best statistic I can always think of on this is that in the year 2000, 3% of the world was interneted. Remember, the internet only came about in 1985. 3% of the world was interneted in the year 2000. Next year, 2010, 30% of the world will be interneted. That's about 2 billion people. And of the other 70%, half of them will never make a phone call. Globalization is a tremendous force. It's a global revolution, but it's like a train leaving the station. If you can get on the train, even if you're clinging to the back, you'll share in the journey. But if you miss the train, there won't be another. You've missed it. It's a very unequal process. And globalization creates lots of differences in vulnerabilities of our societies, which is really what the Home Secretary was talking about. I mean, traditionally, up to the 19th century, populations were vulnerable in world politics if their army and their navy got beaten, because then the population was vulnerable to the enemy. In the 20th century, you could be vulnerable even if your Air Force, if your Air Force got beaten, because you could be bombed. And even if your Air Force was still up and running, you could still be bombed. The whole point now is that in the 21st century, whether your Army, your Navy, or your Air Force is in full working order, you are still vulnerable because as citizens, we can be affected by all sorts of things. So that the targets and the vulnerabilities are immense compared to any other historical era. And that's partly as a result of globalization. One of the phrases that the military uses is that in future military campaigns, we are vulnerable from the bank to the battlefield. Our cyber systems, our social structures, right through to what our soldiers, sailors, and airmen do on our behalf, is vulnerable to those who might want to attack it. So globalization creates that sort of problem. And there are lots of interesting subtleties in that. We always think the pipelines are a great source of vulnerability, as indeed they are, gas and oil pipelines. But gas pipelines are being rapidly replaced by LNG, a new generation of tankers moving around the world, which gives enormous flexibility, and these can go all sorts of places. But LNG tankers are pretty vulnerable. They're not as vulnerable as people think, but nevertheless, those out there who want to do harm to the global energy structure will start to target what they can do to these huge 130,000-ton LNG tankers. So globalization creates a different pattern of vulnerability. Now, what the Home Secretary is talking about is the issue of how does a government in a globalized society protect its citizens? He talked about the problems of the pressures of migration. And that is on everyone's electoral agenda in Europe and the developed world for the foreseeable future. This is an issue. Because of the inequalities in the globalized world, and because of the ease of movement of the poor to the rich, then there is a pressure. If thousands of people want to move to your country, you can stop it. If tens of thousands of people want to move to your country, you can still stop it, even hundreds of thousands with military means. But if millions of people want to move from the poor to the rich world, by hook or by crook, over a long period, they will. They will find ways of doing it over a long period. It will tend to happen. So migration is on everyone's electoral agenda. The issue that we face, I think, is it's not all bad. As a country, we are good at globalization. We are a very globalized country. We're good at operating in a globalized system, and that's partly because we accept the vulnerabilities that creates in our multicultural society, in our movements, in the fact that London is the international city in the world. We're quite good at all of that. And the government's national security strategy was, I think, a very good intellectual attempt to get on top of that, to say, what does a country like the United Kingdom need to protect in the future? And the answer is not exactly our borders. That's not an issue anymore. What we need to protect is our way of life. And the phrase that came out again and again in the national security strategy and all the iterations since is the ability of UK citizens to go about their business freely and with confidence. And those are the phrases, freely and with confidence. And so what that means is actually rather subtle. Anyone we say is a citizen should be able to go about their business freely and confidently. And that's where the perceptual nature of security comes in. A lot of security is about perception. Remember, in 2005, 52 people were killed in a terrorist attack. Since 2005, 12,000 people have been killed on our roads. But that doesn't bother us particularly because somehow we're in control of that. It's not the numbers, it's the intention behind the deaths that bother us. It's perception. It's the same in Afghanistan. Military commanders say things are moving against us in Afghanistan, not because of what's happening on the ground, but because of the perception. And they say a 10% improvement in our position on the ground can create a 40% swing of the pendulum back towards a perception that the coalition forces are prevailing. That's the problem. There's a perceptual pendulum that swings backwards and forwards on the basis of comparatively small changes in the real situation, in that situation where the rubber hits the road. So my bottom line on all of this is that in offering, as it were, a bit of outside independent context on what the Home Secretary has just said, is that the way towards greater security for the United Kingdom is to accept that we are good at globalization, to embrace it, to embrace the vulnerabilities that involves, and to find ways of dealing with them. If you can do that, then that is the holy grail of security. Because if we are a society of people who go about our business freely and with confidence, then we are extremely secure. And however many people may be affected or even killed or injured will not actually affect the workings of our society. One caveat I have to all of that is that having performed, I think, the right intellectual somersault to try to get hold of this problem of how does a country like the UK, in a globalized world, in a revolutionary situation, which we are in world politics, how do we make our policy? Having done that, I have to say we are not well structured in government to carry it through. I think we've done the intellectual job, but the government is not well organized and well structured. We're still structured under the 19th, 20th century model of the way we look at policy, not on the 21st century model, and that's something we as a society have got to address in the next few years, the sooner the better.